Pacific Electric was the pinnacle of a lot of different and complicated things. It took a long and convoluted road towards each other, but it's nowhere near as complicated and convoluted as how this retelling is going to be of it. So the Los Angeles Railway, it was just one piece of the puzzle, but we already know that part of the story.
Yeah.
Exhaustively. Yeah. So I'm going to start at the opposite end of the board with a very large figure in LA history that you touched on, but here's a little more.
I'm going to
touch him a little bit more. Moses Sherman, again. So he was born December 3rd, 1853 in Vermont.
Vermont?
That's how he pronounced it. And eventually he grew up to be a teacher until he moved to Arizona for health reasons and morphed into a school superintendent.
Oh.
But nurturing child's minds was not enough for Mr. Sherman. He decided to build a railroad in Phoenix, and then by a chance visit to LA in 1889, he experienced LA's cable car system, and he noticed all the shortcomings of the cable car technology, and he realized that electricity and moving to LA was the way to go. So Sherman teamed up with his brother-in-law, Eli Clark. He started a business converting the old cable cars to electric trolleys and the other stuff, etc., etc. Meanwhile, another team comprised of Andrew McNally, Colonel G.G. Green.
Oh, okay.
Did you talk about him? Was that one of your colonels?
No, G.G. Green, I would have made a joke.
So there's 3 colonels involved in this?
There are.
All right. Actually, there's another colonel coming up.
And they never became popcorn.
So, elotes.
What was the first name? Andrew
Lloyd Webber. So it was Andrew McNally, Colonel G.G. Green, and those dastardly Woodbury brothers.
Oh, boy.
But they had already formed the Pasadena Railway Company in 1887 to bring rails to the rich people in Altadena and connect them to pretty much what I think is the same exact place, Pasadena.
One has a hill and one's flat. What can't you tell the difference between?
Their names. Sherman and Clark wanted to do more than just pull cables off of old trolleys. So they got to work. Yeah, I'm laying the smack down on you. They got to work, and in 1894 they created the Pasadena and Los Angeles Electric Railway and bought up all of those rail companies that were operating up in the Pasadena area. So then May 1st, 1895, they opened up Southern California's first interurban rail line from downtown LA to Pasadena. So this was actually one of the first interurban rail lines in the whole country.
High five.
Before this, the only way you could get from LA to Pasadena was by steam train or a very long horse and buggy ride, and it was a nice train, it seems. They said of this train, it is to the usual electric line what a Pullman service is to an old-fashioned car.
Ooh.
And we know how nice the Pullman cars were and how coveted those jobs were in the Central Avenue area.
Yes, that was the job to have.
And also not as racist as other jobs you could be working.
No. I mean, I can list all the racist jobs if you want me to.
So what was one of the major stops on this new train, you asked?
Can I ask that?
Please ask me.
What was one of the major stops in the new train, I asked?
Stupid questions. It was to the Cowston Ostrich Farm in South Pasadena as part of ostrich mania that was apparently sweeping the nation.
Look at it! Look at this thing!
It's like a giant chicken. So they claim to be the country's first ostrich farm, but we know that a certain Colonel, Griffith J. Griffith, had one in Griffith Park since 1885. The Cowston one opened in 1886, and it cost 25 cents round trip on the electric train to get there, admission included. The Griffith Ostrich Farm is reached by the Los Angeles Ostrich Farm Railway Company, a line which actually...
They named it that.
That line got bought around this time by Sherman and Clark, so they were already building up their whole empire. They didn't hang onto the Pasadena line very long, though, and they lost it to a Chicago company in mid-1897 who thought the story wasn't confusing enough, so they changed the name from Pasadena and Los Angeles Electric Railway. I'm saying it too.
Railway.
We're both Wait. So they changed it from the Pasadena and Los Angeles. Sorry, I'm from Vermont.
Vermont?
They changed it from the let's try this one more time. The Pasadena and Los Angeles Electric Railway. They changed it from that to the Los Angeles and Pasadena Electric Railway Company.
Wow.
But that wasn't the end of Sherman and Clark, because at the time the space between downtown LA and the beach was just a bunch of farms or otherwise uninhabited land, and Sherman knew that if somebody could develop an efficient way to be transported to and from those areas from downtown, then the treasures of Lonely Mountain are open to you, and smog is nowhere to be found, Greg.
It's all guitar solos from here on out.
Jimmy Page comes in, reads you a riddle. So on November 9th, 1896, they they opened the Pasadena and Pacific Railroad, which connected them back to Pasadena via downtown LA all the way to Santa Monica.
Wow.
So this was Sherman and Clark's crowning achievement for LA. Their empire, as of January 3rd, 1898, became known as the Los Angeles Pacific Railway Company, and that's really the only name for them that you have to remember.
It took them long enough to learn to simplify.
So they basically controlled all the rail transportation in all of western LA County. At their peak in 1906, they had around 170 miles of track.
Jeez.
Sherman's name is found all over LA in places like Sherman Oaks, Sherman Way. West Hollywood even used to be called Sherman because he's the man that made it possible to live there without being a dirty farmer. So now it's time.
My family's full of clean farmers, except Jethro.
Now it's time to revisit our old friend, Henry Huntington. Let's get the full story. He was born Henry Edwards Huntington, February 27th, 1850 in Oneonta, New York. He worked at a few hardware stores as a kid, but he had a strong family connection in the form of his uncle, Collis P. Huntington, who was a titan of the railroad industry.
He was one of the 4 big men of the California railroads, right? I think the octopus is about him.
You'll hear what the octopus is about.
Did you just put me in my place?
Yeah, he was one of the big 4 in the country of railroad people. An octopus has more than 4 arms. You'll find out. Collis was... This turns into an episode on the anatomy of octopuses. Collis was a major player in the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Southern Pacific, and the Central Pacific, which is the company that made the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad.
Okay.
In 1869, Henry went to his mega-uncle to inspect a part of the Chesapeake and Ohio, where his uncle offered him a job managing a sawmill. So he accepted and worked his way up and up. Eventually became the superintendent himself of construction for a few railroad sections. Then in 1890, Uncle Collis became president of Southern Pacific, and Henry moved to San Francisco with him to be his assistant. And in 1892, Henry became vice president of the whole company. So during this time, Henry helped build the Market Street Railway in San Francisco.
Really?
Yeah, and a railway that connected San Francisco to Portland. And he also had personal interest in LA with Larry. He had a little fling with Larry, and the Pasadena line also. Henry was the golden nephew, and it looked like everybody, especially to Henry, that he was being groomed to take over Southern Pacific when Collis was dead and rotting. Then in 1900, Collis died and he started to rot. So then 2/3 of Collis's estate was left to Collis's second wife, Arabella, and 1/3 of it went to Henry. And it looked like Henry was going to be the new president, but there was another guy in the picture.
Oh, no.
Some hotshot whiz kid from Wall Street named Edward Harriman.
E.H.?
So Harriman got the taste of railroad blood in his mouth in 1879 when he bought stock in a dying railroad, turned it around, sold it for profit. Then he wanted more lifeblood of America, so he started buying stock in many railroads, and by 1897 he was director of Union Pacific. And when Uncle Collis died, Harriman bought up a controlling amount of shares in Southern Pacific and named himself president over Henry, who was so upset about this, he cashed out of Southern Pacific for $50 million and turned his focus to LA to build his own empire. And on November either 10th or 12th, 1901, Henry Huntington's Pacific Electric Railway Company was born, henceforth known as PE, Physical Education.
Physical Electric.
On the board of directors were a man named Epes Randolph and a man named Isaiah Hellman, who he said, again, he was the Hellman that helped form the Farmers and Merchants Bank, which was formerly the Temple and Workman Bank, who are some other people we talked about that Tiburcio Vasquez robbed.
Okay.
To that I say, what the Hellman? So now the stage was set for the huge battle over who would unify LA by rail. So there were 3 main contenders. In one corner, Henry Huntington with PE.
Not a good boxer name.
In the next corner, Sherman and Clark with LA Pacific. Yeah. In the next corner, you have Harriman with Southern Pacific. And that's all the corners because the ring is shaped like a triangle. Huntington started buying up as many local rail companies as he could until PE pretty much owned all the rails in the city that didn't belong to Southern Pacific or LA Pacific. Then there was the LA Traction Company, like you talked about. Huntington made it very clear that he was out to push Southern Pacific out of the city.
Right.
He was very bitter about what they had done to him.
Understandably.
Yeah, so the Southern Pacific trains were steam-powered, but the PE trains ran on electricity, so they were cheaper, faster, cleaner, more efficient, and their tracks many times were running parallel to the Southern Pacific tracks. Huntington also converted the tracks of the companies he bought here we go, to standard 4-foot 8.5 gauge. So they could also use their electric trains to pull freight to offer connections through the city to Southern Pacific's rival companies to further try to push Southern Pacific out of LA.
Bitter.
Very bitter. And I like it. The exception to this gauge was downtown, where the LARy trains were using the narrower 3-foot 6-inch gauge. Yeah. It's all about girth, though.
You can't ride on our rails? That sucks, huh?
No, here's the thing. Where the two services overlapped, they had dual gauge track, with the PE trains using the two outer tracks and LARy using the inner rails.
Well, I guess I'll just go home then. Pathetic. This is what business is done?
The first brand new line that PE built was the Long Beach line that connected downtown to Long Beach. It opened July 4th, 1902, and on the first day it carried 15,000 people to Long Beach.
Oh my God, one car.
We didn't think it through. But Huntington had even bigger plans for PE. His dream was to someday have an electric rail line that connected San Diego to LA to Santa Barbara.
No.
Hearsay.
No. What are you going to call that? Like the
Metrolink? The Surfliner?
That's what it is, a Surfliner.
He never lived to see that happen, but just his dreaming of that made Harriman so nervous because Southern Pacific already had been running a train from LA to Santa Barbara through the Santa Susana Pass, formerly a prime target for stagecoaches for Tiburcio Vasquez.
Also, Manson family
lived up there. They just loved to see the choo-choos pass. The tunnel they built there was the longest in Southern California, by the way.
Really?
Having one of Huntington's sleek and sexy electric trains competing with that was the last thing that Harriman needed. So in response, Harriman threatened to put more competitive pressure on Huntington's street railways by undercutting his prices by offering 3-cent rides compared to their 5-cent rides. Tension was high, and as a result, the LA Traction Company lines became a key battle between Huntington and Harriman. They had lines around downtown, the Traction Company, and they also owned the Central Pacific Railway, which connected downtown to San Pedro, and they were already competing with Huntington's downtown lines that he had, and he didn't want to have to compete with Harriman's low-price threats as well, so the owner put the company up for sale. This was the last major rail company in the city other than LA Pacific that was still independent, so getting control of this would give either Pacific Electric or Southern Pacific a huge advantage over the other one, so a bidding war ensued, and in late April 1903, Harriman won it for $1,800,000 plus $100,000 in cash, which in today's dollar is almost $50 million. Which is everything that Huntington got from cashing out of Southern Pacific. But he didn't
saved it.
He dodged a bullet. The bullet still hit him.
He dodged a bullet and ran into another bullet, which I feel is a joke we've made before.
Yeah, I think we did. The next big showdown happened not even a month later in May 1903 when the city had an auction to sell off the rights to build rails on 6th Street from Figueroa all the way to Hollywood. So Huntington was in the room to do his own bidding, but Harriman was back in San Francisco and only had a representative there. I think you can see who cared more about the city. Neither of them. The rights were expected to go for $10,000. Harriman ended up winning them for $110,000, and Huntington decided this is getting out of hand. So
I'm going to kill him.
I thought I would never have to assassinate again, but here I go. So that night, he took a train to San Francisco to talk to Harriman, and they reached an agreement.
I'm going to fight you.
Our two trains are going to play chicken. Southern Pacific would stop encroaching on Pacific Electric's desire to expand, but Pacific Electric was no longer majority owned by Huntington.
He let that slide.
This was the deal. Huntington got 40% of the stocks in Pacific Electric, but now Southern Pacific also owned 40% of the company. The other 20% went to the other partners like Hillman.
Okay.
Obviously, Huntington was not happy about this, but he had to do it to save PE. So our kids need to be fit in case a war breaks out. Unfortunately for Huntington, in the long run, he just couldn't bear to live being less powerful than Southern Pacific, but he couldn't go against the guy who owned just as big a part of his company as he did. So to get around this, Huntington created the Los Angeles Interurban Railway Company for $10 million and bought up almost all the stocks in it to prevent another power struggle like this. And he attempted to begin a new empire from scratch. He used the Interurban to buy up other smaller lines like the Glendale Electric Railroad Company, but he also used it as a sort of supplement to the PE lines that he still did have some control over. Right. Now, in addition to owning these rail companies, Huntington also owned the Pacific Electric Land Company.
Oh.
This is where the real estate stuff comes in. This meant that he owned not just a means of transportation, he also owned land. So that meant he could design the tracks to take people to the land that he owned, and what luck, there's a ton of brand new houses for sale on this land. Huntington used the Interurban to not just connect existing PE lines to existing cities, but also to connect PE lines to cities that he was creating out of nothing, and he also had a major stake in them. Real estate was a major business in LA at the time. By 1910, 45% of all households in LA were actually owned by by the people living in it, which was the highest number of any American city.
Yeah.
Huntington would advertise his new homes in the newspaper, and he'd have free rail rides out to see them, complete with free barbecue for anybody who came.
Oh, block party. We both know this is a monopoly, right?
It's not a monopoly. It's an oligopoly. So we're going out to this wasteland. There's going to be a hot dog for me. So they'd get there, then they would have an auction to sell off the houses, and conveniently, the rails wouldn't leave back to downtown until the auction was over.
Wow.
But the people that moved into these homes would also need water, right? You need that.
Yeah.
Lucky for them, Huntington also owned stock in water companies, so he was able to provide them that service. What about electricity? Well, friends,
oh my
Huntington
God.
also owned...
Doesn't he know it's bad to mix electricity and water?
Huntington also owned 51% of the stock in the Pacific Light and Power Company with its Big Creek hydroelectric plant in the Sierras. So let's break it down. Huntington made trains that were electric, so his electric companies would benefit from that. Water is needed to generate electricity, so his water companies were all set there. Then he needed customers for his trains, but to have customers, there needs to be a place for them to go, so he built houses in previously hard to get to areas away from downtown so that people would need to use his trains to get to and from them. Then, after collecting the one-time fee from the purchase of their house, they would then need their furniture shipped to the new homes. Luckily, his trains also provided freight service. Then, after those initial moving into your new home fee were taken care of, he then collected the monthly fees from the water and power needed to live in these remote areas for all of eternity.
What an extensive robbery.
Well, this is why people called people like him robber barons.
Yeah.
People accused the Huntington conglomeration of being a monopoly, but the way he saw it, he wasn't forcing people to buy homes on his land.
God.
They just
you
were.
Could just walk back if you don't want to be here for the auction.
You could use a horse. I think there's a few of them still in the city. They were just living there, and it was part of the deal that if they lived there, they then had to get their utilities from Huntington companies. That's it. That's just part of the deal. Where else are you going to get it? Mulholland?
Oh, there's a well about 6 miles over. You can't take the rail, though. You should walk.
It wasn't just Huntington that was doing stuff like this. Sherman and Clark with the LA Pacific were doing the same sort of thing. Harriman was right there with Huntington. The two of them were among the founders of the San Fernando Mission Land Company when it formed on November 28, 1904, and bought up the land that George Porter owned and turned it all into basically the northern part of the valley. Jesus. So things like this and the trains that Huntington was bringing to them made living in places like the valley and along the beach possible. Yeah. He created places like Redondo Beach. That's his brainchild.
Yes.
He is the Huntington of Huntington Beach. Huntington's profits were coming not from the actual operating of the rails themselves, but from the real estate deals that he was making. For some reason, nobody minded this or realized that there's only so much land that you can sell, so this would reveal itself to be a major problem later, but for now things seemed golden. Yeah. As a display of this wealth, aside from his 63-foot-long private rail car called the Alabama, Huntington decided to erect an appropriate headquarters for his company, and on January 15, 1905, the Huntington Building opened up on 6th and Main, better known as the Pacific Electric Building. Right. It's 9 stories high, and it was the biggest building in the city, and for a time was the tallest building west of the Mississippi. Wow. They say that this building is responsible for drawing the city's business district from 2nd and Spring to 6th and Main. So in addition to just offices, the bottom of it was the central terminal of all the PE lines. Oh, okay. It was the finest example of railroad terminal design west of Chicago, and it was our equivalent to New York's Grand Central. Not as nice, though. There were shops and services in there that actually accounted for a big business for PE. By the late 1940s, these shops were taking in over $100,000 a year, Jesus. Which is $8 billion in today's dollars. There was a popcorn stand.
Can we go there right now?
Oh, the Colonels got that. Starting in 1908, Kohl's has been serving French dip sandwiches right on their main floor.
Wow.
Yeah. In 1905, 5,000 passengers would pass through the main terminal a day. Huntington had even grander plans of expanding train service to even more new housing areas as far out as Lake Arrowhead. But like I said, most of the money was coming from his side companies, not from the actual trains, and the minority investors in Pacific Electric, led by Hellman, they urged Huntington to slow down with the expanding and focus more on making money off the actual trains that they already had. Yeah. Huntington, of course, refused, and the minority investors went to Harriman and begged him to buy them out of the company. And being such a kind man as he was, he obliged. And in December 1904, Southern Pacific gained 60% control of Pacific Electric and used that power to force Huntington to stop with his expansion. However, since he still owned majority shares of the LA Interurban, he was able to do what he wanted with them, which is why he had been using that company to do a lot of the expansion bidding that I was talking about. I told you this would be very confusing.
No, it sort of makes sense.
Even so, the things Huntington was doing with the Interurban bothered Harriman because it posed a threat to the local Southern Pacific and Union Pacific lines in town, both of which Harriman owned, so he figured it was time to tighten Huntington's leash yet again. Huntington's Interurban had an agreement with Sherman and Clark's LA Pacific not to build in each other's territory, but the LA Pacific was in hard times, so on March 19th, 1906, Harriman bought 51% of the stock in LA Pacific and assumed control. So now Harriman owned all of the rails surrounding Huntington's Interurban, and Huntington was now boxed in and could physically not expand any further.
Wow.
So what did the ever valiant Huntington do? That was it. He lost. The game was over. On June 30th, 1908, Huntington gave up the Interurban to Pacific Electric, and now Harriman had it all. Huntington maintained control of Larry, but who can really control Larry?
Nobody.
That was all he had. His dreams of a railroad empire were over, and Harriman finally won. Then Harriman got sick and died on November 9th, 1909. But by that time, Huntington had mostly quit the business, and he started devoting his life to collecting art and books and growing his toenails up at his mansion in San Marino with his second wife. This might be the weirdest part of the story. To tell you about his second wife, let's first mention his first wife, Mary, whom he divorced in March 1906.
Okay.
The divorce hearing lasted 7 minutes, and at the end of it, Mary won $1 million in the settlement, which was the biggest divorce settlement in U.S. history up to the time. Who was his second wife? Unky Collis's widow, Arabella, who was actually, she was 3 years younger than Henry was, and them getting married just confirmed everybody's suspicion that they had been having an affair for a very long time. That's very gross. He just wanted to be his uncle.
Oh.
In all senses of the word. Henry died May 23rd, 1927 in Philadelphia. His body is buried at his old estate, which is now known as the Huntington Library and Gardens, which is a very nice place to visit.
It's very expensive to get in.
They can when they're closed.
Yeah.
His mausoleum is considered the model for the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Wow, really?
Now that things got so complicated, it seemed like the new heads of PE were as confused as we are, so they decided to simplify everything. August 24th, 1911, Southern Pacific merged together the Pacific Electric, the LA Interurban, the LA Pacific, the Los Angeles and Redondo Railway Company, the Riverside and Arlington Railway Company, the San Bernardino Traction Company, Redland Central Railway Company, and the San Bernardino Interurban Railway Company, and they were now all part of the same rail system known as the new Pacific Electric. That's it. That's the cap.
Okay.
This is the Pacific Electric everyone remembers so fondly. The only independent line after this merger was the Glendale and Montrose Railway.
Oh, yeah.
The fleet of all 8 companies involved in the merger were consolidated, and all trains were painted red, which is why they were always referred to as the red cars, the big red cars. Operations began September 1st, 1911. Their slogan became safety, comfort, speed, conglomerations, monopoly, gouging.
Buy me.
Southern Pacific moved into the Pacific Electric building and booted Huntington's company to the LA Railway building, Larry B, at 11th and Broadway. After the merger, PE mostly stopped expanding other than a line to Fullerton, and then the San Bernardino line, that was the longest line that they had. It was 58 miles.
Okay, yeah.
And with that, Pacific Electric became the biggest interurban train system in the world. And not just that, it was called the world's greatest interurban railway at its peak, 1925, not 1924, like I said.
We peaked before you.
Ours was a bigger peak. 1925, there were 1,164 miles of track serving 950 passenger cars running 2,700 times a day, serving 125 communities throughout LA, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. It covered 25% more track mileage than the current New York City subway system.
Wow.
They accounted for 10% of all the investment in streetcar lines in the entire country. It all emanated out of downtown and stretch into the valley through Burbank and Van Nuys, and as far west as Chatsworth and as far north as San Fernando. It stretched west along the coast as far north as the Pacific Palisades and went all the way down along the coast through Santa Monica, Ocean Park, Venice, El Segundo, Hyperion, Manhattan, Redondo, down to Clifton. They went south down to San Pedro, Point Furman, and Long Beach. They went out to Fullerton and Glendora and way out east to Redlands, Riverside, and Corona.
That's so far.
It's very far. They even extended into the Tainted Bells of Orange County down to Balboa and Santa Ana. They could take you along the beach on a snowy mountain through orange groves or through a busy city on the same day.
Yeah.
The rails were originally divided into 4 districts: Eastern, Western, Northern. Guess the last.
Did you say Northern already?
It's Southern. Oh, that's fun. Within a few years, though, the North and the East got combined into just Northern. The Northern was the largest of the districts with around 400 miles of track on 33 separate lines. The Western District was made up of all the old LA Pacific lines, the Glendale Burbank line, the San Fernando Valley line, and the 8th Street Local in Santa Monica. And at their peak, they had around 260 miles of track over 12 lines with 566 cars making 395 trips a day. There was not much freight in the Western District, but who did have a lot of freight business was the Southern District, who was carrying around 35% of all freights coming in from the ports of LA and Long Beach.
Yeah.
Pacific Electric was the 3rd largest freight carrier in the US.
Wow.
There was a lot of worker trains that they employed also, like their job was to be a train. They would just ride the rails to grease up the overhead electrical wires.
Yeah.
Some of them burned off weeds that were growing on the tracks, which I would love to see, just like flames shooting out of the bottom. Or they would like grind down the rails.
Right.
Some served as portable generator substations that they'd use for heavy traffic events like the Rose Parade or races at Santa Anita or the LA County Fair in Pomona. Right. There was a big train repair hub in Torrance and another one at 7th and Alameda. The trains themselves were pretty nice at first. Some of them could go up to 55 miles per hour. Some of them had reversible seats. They could flip around when the train hit the end of the line so you wouldn't be facing backwards and vomit everywhere. Some of the trains were even the former Pullman trains, but the finest ones were said to be the Hollywood trains. Even finer were special cars they used exclusively for celebrities and visiting presidents.
Air Force
Air Force trolley. There were strictly industrial type trains like the 4-track high-speed line going through Watts, but then there were the lines that were almost like the neighborhood milkman going by who just happened to be on a giant electric train. The Echo Park line would have housewives running up to it on the street asking the driver to pick something up from the store for her and he'd drop it off on his way back. The Echo Park line, they had cars running every 5 minutes during peak hours. Yeah. Pacific Electric was also running the last interurban railway post office in the country up until 1950 on the San Bernardino line. You could rent funeral trains as hearses to transport mourners and corpses to wherever your funeral was. There was a Venice high school train that was exclusively for taking students to class. You could also take the trains to Venice straight over the canals and right to the amusement piers, letting you off at the Central Lagoon.
That's right.
There were a lot of specialty rides in specially designed observation cars you could take that sounded like a lot of fun. This is going to be great.
Blow my mind.
Trips like the Seeing Los Angeles ride, the Chinatown trip, the Old Mission tour, the Triangle Trolley trip that took you to all the beach cities in the South Bay, the Catalina Special, which took you to Wilmington, where you then boarded a boat to Catalina, boat fare included in your ticket price.
Wow.
There was the Orange Empire Trolley trip, which for $4 took you to Riverside, Redlands, and San Bernardino, and was advertised as a day's journey of 175 miles through the Citrus Belt and its cities.
It's the Meekly train. I would have loved to ride it.
It left at 9 a.m. from the main terminal downtown, as all the special excursion trains did. It was narrated by a real live tour guide. One of the most popular ones was the Balloon Route excursion. Not up in the air, but down on the earth. The scenic trolley trip goes one way and returns another. 101 miles for 100 cents. One whole day for $1.
Oh,
36 miles right along the ocean shore. The only way to see it all and see it right. In case you didn't catch it, it didn't actually go in the air. No. It was called the Balloon Route because the path of the rails was shaped like a balloon. It took you from downtown through Hollywood to the house of the painter Paul de Longpre, who lived at 1741 Cahuenga, through the bean fields that eventually became Beverly Hills, then to a wounded soldier's home in Sawtell, where you would get your portrait taken with your favorite wounded soldier.
Yeah.
They would have an official Pacific Electric photographer on the scenic steps of the wounded soldier's home. The photographer photographer would take your picture, then go back downtown to develop the pictures to have it for when you got back there, they could sell it to you by the time you got back at the end of the day. Meanwhile, your journey continued to the Long Wharf in Santa Monica, which is a ridiculous thing. As its name promised, it was a long wharf that jutted off the coast of Santa Monica almost a mile into the ocean and was reachable only by train since it was originally used as the city's industrial port until San Pedro opened up. It was the longest wharf in the world, but don't feel stupid for never having noticed it because it's not there.
Did it burn down?
I'm sure it did. They accidentally sent the weed burner train on there. So there's a trolley in the ocean if you want to find it.
I do.
From there, they went to the Camera Obscura in Santa Monica.
Oh, yeah.
Then to a nice fish dinner at the Playa del Rey Pavilion. Then on to Redondo and Moonstone Beach, which was a part of Redondo Beach that used to have all these moonstones that washed up onto it. And you could take them and get them cleaned up as souvenirs.
This all sounds so fantastic.
I would love to do this. And for $1, Greg, you can't beat that
100
price.
cents.
Then you headed back up to the Venice amusement piers for an hour before you headed back downtown, and you could buy your picture with a wounded soldier. This trip, it was hugely popular, and during the summer and winter, an average of 10,000 people took the tour every month. The reason for its success was due to a man named C.M. Pierce, who heavily promoted the balloon route at all places tourists could be found in the city. He would go to hotels and be like, ride my train, and they would kick him out all the time, and he'd keep coming back. He made it a thing that you needed to do if you were visiting LA. He even went as far as to make sure all the tour guides on the excursion were physically strong men so that when they spoke, people would listen to them. And if you didn't, head down to the track. It was such a hit that he started opening up balloon routes in other cities as well. The most popular of these excursions was the trip up to Mount Lowe, as you briefly mentioned, aka the railway to the clouds, not equaled by any trolley trip in the world at any price.
It is very Matterhorn. Yeah, I was looking at
There's a Yeti at the end.
I was looking at pictures of it. It looks fascinating. I really wish I could.
And also really scary.
Yeah, that's what's great.
It was started long before Pacific Electric by Professor Thaddeus Sobieski Court Lowe, who built the Pasadena and Mount Wilson Railway Company, which opened July 4th, 1893, and went from Altadena to Rubio Canyon, where he had a hotel and a dance hall. From there, you went up the Great Incline on one of Greg's famous funiculars, which was a vomit-makingly steep incline engineered by David McPherson that took you to the top of Echo Mountain, where you were now in White City, presumably named because only white people were allowed, which had a couple hotels, an observatory, a zoo, a museum, and also the world's largest searchlight that had a 35-mile projection. Lowe's publicist said he could read a newspaper by the beam of its light coming through his hotel window on Catalina Island. And here's a nice treat. If it was your birthday, you could get the light shown onto your house.
Oh.
I can't even imagine how many missed houses they got until they finally got the right house.
Woke everybody up.
Well, it was shut down in the 30s for being a public nuisance.
Yeah, I could do that.
From here, you went even higher up on what was basically a Disneyland parking tram with no doors to the top of Oak Mountain, soon to be renamed Mount Lowe in honor of the good professor, where there were views of all LA and a place called Ye Alpine Tavern. The whole rail experience was sold to the LA Railway in 1901, then Pacific Electric took it over in 1902. The trip was $250.
Oh no.
And left 5 times a day from the main terminal. Unfortunately, this was all in a particularly nature-filled part of nature, and the elements were not kind to it. There were repeated fires and floods that caused severe damage. In 1929, the observatory got destroyed by a windstorm, which I don't even know what that is. A tornado? And in 1936, the tavern burned down for good, and rainstorms damaged the tracks beyond repair. And in 1938, the railway was closed for good. But in its 45 years of existence, some 3 million people took a trip up there. You can hike up there nowadays along where the old tracks used to be. And in 1993, the Mount Lowe Incline Railway was put on the National Register of Historic Places. Well, if things were going so well for Pacific Electric, they had all these nice, fun things. Why isn't it still here today?
Why isn't it still here today, Daniel?
Let me tell you, little stupid boy. You can believe what Roger Rabbit tells you, that GM bought up all the trains and shut them down so that they could sell their buses to the city, but you would be an idiot. GM did have a minor part in the downfall, but so did many other companies, like you said. The conspiracy theory, it's just based on this misguided article that was written by this guy named Bradford Snell.
Idiot.
In 1974.
In the era of great names, to be named Snell.
The reality was the same way with the downtown theater district or Googie architecture. There was a lot of factors. Most of all, the city just kind of outgrew it. This message brought to you by Judge Doom. One factor was the Depression. Nobody had any jobs to commute to, and nobody had extra money to go shopping downtown, so they had no need to go gallivanting on the trains around the city.
I can spend a dime on the train.
In 1910, the average transit rides per person in the main parts of LA was nearly 400. By 1939, it was barely over 200.
Great.
From 1929 to 1933, Pacific Electric lost half of its revenue, and to try to tempt riders back, fares were cut in half, and they even offered a Sunday pass where you could ride unlimited trains on all PE lines for $1. Didn't work. An even bigger factor was our old friend, the automobile.
Oh no.
Giver and slayer of Los Angeles charm. As the 20th century got older, personal cars became more reliable, and they also started becoming status symbols that everyone wanted to have, so the transition to private transportation began, and it did not stop, and by 1919, there were almost 141,000 gas cars on the road in LA. There's that many in my
garage right now, my car hole.
Yeah, I'm Jay Leno. Didn't you know that? This meant the roads were more crowded and cars were getting in the way of the trains, which slowed them down and made them even less desirable to commuters. Train appeal died, and nobody knew yet that more gas and less electric was bad for the environment. And also dying were pedestrians. As the streets got more crowded, so did the sidewalks, and a lot of people got hit and killed by PE trains in the busy intersections. The trains started going slower because of this and made them even less efficient. Getting on some of the trains, you'll see pictures. It's just like a bunch of people crowded in the middle of like Hollywood Boulevard with cars zooming by them. It was ridiculously dangerous, and to try to make things better, the first freeway was opened in 1939 and many more followed. The freeways weren't crowded yet, and they never would be, so they tempted even more people to buy their own cars, and the construction of the actual freeways themselves paved over some of the old rail tracks. Pacific Electric tried to work with the freeways, like on the 101, which originally had a middle section of train tracks in the Cahuenga Pass near Universal Studios. A train used to ride down there in the middle. One of the biggest traffic problems was what was going on in front of the central hub on Main Street. All the Pacific Electric lines converged there, so it caused a huge traffic pileup at all times of the day, and with more and more cars coming onto the road, it just kept getting worse. They made an attempt to alleviate things in 1910 by building an elevated platform onto the Pacific Electric building for the northern and southern lines to come in on and avoid the main entrance that everybody was crushing in on, but it still wasn't enough. So in 1916, they extended the platform to San Pedro Street, and they had even more plans to build it further crossing the LA River. Depression quickly put an end to that.
Depression purifies all.
Even so, it still wasn't enough. So in 1922, the California Railroad Commission issued Order Number 9928 for all Japanese people to
all Japanese cars have to leave.
The order was for Pacific Electric to build a subway for its western district lines to use to alleviate the traffic in front of the Main Street building. What resulted was a second hub for PE in the form of the subway terminal building at 417 Hill Street at Hill and 4th. It opened November 3rd, 1925, with its first train running out December 1st. The building was designed by the guys who did the Biltmore Hotel and the Waldorf Astoria in New York. There was a height limit for a building in the city at a time.
You must be this many floors if you want to ride this ride.
So the height limit for a building, you couldn't be over 150 feet. So they went right up to 150 feet. It's 10 stories high, and it was the new biggest office building in the city. The terminal was in the basement, where subways tend to be usually. It's right under Fort Moore Hill, home of the Lizard People Gold. The tunnels are now off limits, but listen to Creepy Christmas, Haunted Hanukkah Part Boo to find out how you can sneak down
listen to
there.
it right now and then come back to us.
Yeah, it'll be the longest listening experience of your life. The tunnel is 4,325 feet long, 28 feet wide, 21 feet 3 inches tall, and let you out at around 1st and Glendale, or Toluca Yard as they called it, near the Marionette Theater. It was called the Hollywood Subway, and 65,000 people would pass through here a day. PE had grand plans to build even more subways like this to places like Boyle Heights and South Central, but that required voter support for these plans, and that was not something that PE had ever, mainly because they were so anti-union, like you said, but also their service kind of sucked. So why would the voters tax themselves for a system that is only benefiting its owners? They referred to Pacific Electric as the octopus because of the 8 companies that it merged from. There it is. At the same time, the business people didn't want the rails to go under government control because then they couldn't make money off of it, so they weren't getting any sort of public support or any sort of government support on any level. Things were at a stalemate, and Pacific Electric had a very bad public image. Luckily, World War II happened, and PE got a second wind. The war factor factories came alive and workers needed a way to get to work. Combine that with the gasoline rationing that was going on, and there was a huge surge in rail riding. PE had its all-time high ridership in 1944 with 109 million people.
Damn.
To keep up with all the new riders, PE bought 80 trains from San Francisco to supplement their fleet. They were very large and had 2 giant circular windows in the front that made them look like owls, and they were called the blimps. They also moved troops and war machines around town. The Calship Railway used PE rail paths to transport the 282,000 employees working at the California Shipbuilding Corporation facility on Terminal Island after all the Japanese people had been kicked out of it. But once the war was over, the number of rail commuters dropped again and even more cars came on the road, and it was time to face the reality of the situation that the PE train system was just plain run down.
No one was fixing anything. That's what I keep reading. Like, they're like, yeah, just let it go.
They keep referring to it as deferred maintenance. Yep, that's the right response. And by the time the World War II surge happened, these trains should have been long retired, but they kept them going just to keep up with the demand. Like I said, the trains had no public support, so a tax in 1926 to repair them had been voted down, and they were called a slum on wheels.
Good stuff.
The trains were very expensive to keep up because it wasn't just the trains, but also the power stations and the rails themselves that needed money that you had to pay for. And you also needed to pay several people to operate a train, but it only took one person to operate the much cheaper alternative, a bus. There had from the get-go been...
Look at you finally supporting the bus.
Ride Metro, everybody. The bus is a great place. Have your lunch there. From the get-go, there had been unofficial jitney cars that ran parallel to many of the PE train tracks that was siphoning off a lot of would-be customers with their cheaper fares, but they were also unreliable, and most of them either faded away or were made illegal. In 1926, they estimated they lost $30,000 to these third-party Ubers. Uber goobers. So Pacific Electric figured that they might as well offer a similar service since people apparently wanted it. So they first started experimenting with buses that same year when the San Bernardino to Highland line got replaced with buses. But they tried hard to stay a rail company rather than a bus company, but it started becoming clearer and clearer that buses was going to be the only way to survive. And people actually, for some reason, liked riding on buses.
It's where you met people.
It's where you met your local bus driver, Larry. In 1923, PE and Larry started the Los Angeles Motor Bus Company, which soon became the Los Angeles Motor Coach Company to manage their bus services. Then nicer buses like GM's, this is where GM does come in the story, and it's 45 seaters complete with air conditioning, not just an open window, and even more people wanted to ride these nice new buses. In 1936, rail service to San Bernardino and Redlands was replaced by bus. 1940, the same happened to the lines to Santa Monica, Redondo, and Riverside. The last train to Pasadena ran 1941. No word on the last train to Clarksdale.
One step ahead of you.
Clarksville, not Clarksdale.
You want to go to Clarksdale?
That one's still going. All the rest of the rail operations to the Northern District ceased September 30th, 1951, replaced by bus. Then on October 1st, 1953, Metropolitan Coach Lines bought up all the passenger rail and bus services PE had left with the explicit intention to convert everything to bus. 1954, all the rails were removed from the main concourse of the Pacific Electric building, and the Hollywood lines were turned to bus. The last train to run in the subway was a Glendale Burbank car, June 15th, 1955. This was the last ride of the Western District. They were replaced by bus.
I didn't see that happening.
The rail left the 101. It gave each direction one new lane.
Yeah.
Didn't help. No. The special excursions were shut down. Catalina Special lasted the longest until 1956. Then on March 3rd, 1958, they were sold again to the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Yeah. The Southern District held out the longest and were the only rails still running at the time. They had kept those ones so long because they still ran a nice freight business transporting oil, but it still wasn't enough. And on April 9th, 1961, the final passenger ride on the Long Beach line, always one of the busiest, took place. Long Beach line, if you were paying attention, was the first line that Huntington had built. Poetry. Then on August 13th, 1965, with 45 trains and 210 miles of track left, Pacific Electric was finally put to rest and absorbed once and for all by the winner in this long fight, Southern Pacific. Then on September 11th, 1996, Southern Pacific had to merge with Union Pacific because in the end, no railroad ever wins.
They're all going to the glue factory.
So the problem with PE was that they were just too big to sustain themselves even before cars started becoming a thing, and they weren't even comprehensively built because Huntington designed it just to connect his housing developments to downtown. So no surprise when cars did come out, they were much more useful. They took you through the main thoroughfares, but as the freeways expanded and employment was decentralized, they became less and less efficient for everyday use. On the East Coast, the transit system was created around the city that already existed, but here the city took shape around the transit system. So in that sense, they were never meant to be as reliable as the ones in New York, and because of that, they created their own executioners.
Basically, yeah.
Here's my metaphor. They were just the scaffolding that the city was built around, but then the city was built and the scaffolding had to go. Right. Now the city needs the scaffolding again, and because of that, the old red cars are very romanticized, but when they left, nobody wanted them. They were gross. They were a nuisance, and what's worse, Pacific Electric only made a profit in 3 of its almost half century of years in existence. Like I said, the money was coming from real estate developers, not from providing good service. Where are they now? There's some stuff in Travel Town, but the majority of things that are actually still around are at the Orange Empire Railway Museum in Paris. Not Paris, Paris. Paris in the summer.
Oregon has like a train or rail museum, and I was finding a lot of stuff on their site.
Here's a weird thing. Some of the trains were sold to the General Urquiza Railway in Buenos Aires, so maybe you can ride some of the most likely deadly at this point trains down there, but the majority of the PE trains were just scrapped. Turned to glue and bullets.
Glue and bullets. I think they're in Terminal Island piled up, or San Pedro somewhere. There's photos of it. They're just like stacked up and dead. It's a rail car graveyard.
There's the waterfront red car line in San Pedro, which runs for 1.5 miles from the World Cruise Center all along the waterfront that... combining a lot of things there, that opened July 19th, 2003. There's a couple replicated red cars there, but one of them is an actual original that's been restored, making it the first red car to run on a red car route in over 40 years. Costs $1. You can ride it all day from noon to 9, Friday through Sunday. There's also the Pacific Dining Car Restaurant at 1310 West 6th Street that opened in 1921 as a replica Pacific Electric car, expanded to have more space to eat comfortably in. It was actually movable on train rails.
It was a cop hangout.
I'm not going there. The rest of the city tracks were either removed or paved over, but some of the outer city ones are still used for freight or Metrolink. A lot of the overhead passes and bridges that were made for the trains were turned into regular streets that we probably drive on every day. All of those overhead passes. The old Burbank Southern Pacific line is now the path of the Orange line. The Lancashire train station in North Hollywood's still there, as is the Watts station, and I want to say that there's one in San Fernando also. The outlet of the old subway is paved over with a mural of a red car coming out of it. The subway terminal building itself is now Metro 417 Apartments. Come move here if you're sexy and single. The Pacific Electric building was modernized in 1947, and all bus operations left in 1964 as the elevated structure was raised and the waiting room and the concourse were turned into a parking lot. And the building offices were turned into housing lots in 2005. If you're a little less sexy, come move here.
That's where I belong.
And in a hint, like you said, towards the future and some other excessively long episode, July 14th, 1990, the Blue Line opened, running over basically the same path as the old Long Beach line. In commemoration, that train had a red stripe on it to honor the old red cars and Jamaican beer. So that's the long, complicated path towards a thing that's no longer here.